Hello, and welcome back to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. This is the voice of Lando, and you join us here again with a returning guest, Karim Wafa, to talk about the Afro Arab slave trade and more. If you wanted to catch the first part of this recording, please check the description box where you will find the link. This was a great episode. I so enjoyed talking to Karim about this little understood part of global history, and he will be returning to the channel with all new content very soon. Please like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the video.
But what's very interesting, and if I may just say this now, because I feel like people find this interesting, is that um, my passion for Afro Arab history started with the transatlantic slave trade. I grew up, the first book I ever bought as a kid at the age of 7 with my allowance was the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, who was
Oh.
essentially a main pillar of African American history and who ignited the idea of civil rights in the following centuries. So I essentially grew up studying Afro-Latin, African American history and the transatlantic slave trade. And I was like, wait a second, I find similarities with our part of the world. And that's how I connected the dots. And that's how I ended up researching Afro Arab history. Because I tell people all the time, I mean, within the Arab-led slave trades, and this is not like the transatlantic slave trade in one main area. And this touches on how complex the Arab slave trade was because of the fact that it wasn't one event. The transatlantic slave trade was one event from a certain point in time to a certain point in time, from one location to another, and that was it. Europeans, and especially from Western Europe, began enslaving West Africans and shipping them off to various aspects of the Americas from North, Central, and South America. What we see with the Arab world is that there is no starting point for the Arab-led slave trades. There has been the Arab-led enslavement of African people for thousands of years, and this extends into pre-Islamic times. So a lot of people have this idea that slavery in the Arab world increased because of Islam, and I tell people all the time, as somebody who is a Muslim, who is an Arab, who comes from the region, who studies that history, people used it to their advantage. People essentially manipulated religion because in Islam, slavery is prohibited. Unfortunately, some of the biggest and wealthiest tribal leaders in ancient Arabia over 1,000 years ago were the main people who essentially engaged in the slave trade. And what is very interesting is that essentially over time, what happened was that they ended up taking aspects of Islam and saying that Islam allowed for the enslavement of people who were non-Muslim, whereas Islam says that essentially the Prophet, peace be upon him, at that time he had said that God rewards anybody who frees slaves. So that just shows you, or shows anybody, that Islam doesn't go hand in hand with slavery. But what people did essentially was that they said, oh no, we can't enslave Muslims, so let's go and enslave what people used to say are barbarians. They would essentially go to places that where people would live very nomadic lifestyles. And despite the fact that Arabs, we live nomadic lifestyles as well, which is very contradictory. But they would go around and say, okay, Northern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, the islands of the Pacific, the islands of the Indian Ocean, which are places that were very far from the Middle East for a given point in time, especially in terms of geography. They would say these people have had no influence from the Arab world, so they don't have our civilization. So we see this in very different cultures. We see this even with the Europeans under colonialism. We see it with Orientalism. When somebody doesn't have the culture of the dominant culture in their mind, they would say, okay, so that means they are uncivilized. So that is how we see the igniting fire of the slave trade in the Arab world, because many people essentially said at this point in time that sub-Saharan Africans didn't have Islam so that they could be enslaved. So essentially, you have three main points that acted as breeding grounds for the Arab-led slave trades. And they have been called Arab-led slave trades. They have been called Muslim trades. They have been called Persian trades. And there are just so many different terms. When we talk about the Indian Ocean, I would not say it's an Arab trade. I would say it is the Indian Ocean trade, because the Arabs arrived on the coast of East Africa, and we can talk about this for hours. The Arabs arrived on the coast of East Africa along with the Persians, the Indians, modern-day Pakistanis, and the Indonesians. Although the Arabs made up 3/4 of them, the others were minority, but the others did manage to, how do you say, partake to a significant extent, to a certain extent. And this is why when we look at just how the East African slave trade ended up booming, it boomed because of the interaction of these different ethnicities, which all landed on the shores of East Africa. So essentially, what we're talking about, we're looking at the map of East Africa from Somalia in the north to Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, these four countries. These four countries, and mainly Kenya and Tanzania in their entire coastline. When it comes to Somalia, we're talking about the southern coast of Somalia. When we talk about Mozambique, we're talking about the northern coast of Mozambique. This entire area became labeled the Swahili coast. And the word Swahili comes from the Arabic word Sahel. Sahel means coast. So Swahili coast means coast, which is very interesting. The East African coast became called the Swahili coast, and it became called the Swahili coast through the interactions with the Arabs and the Persians and South Asians and Southeast Asians, essentially, but mainly with the Arabs in this case, because of the fact that the word Swahili comes from Sahel. And the language of Swahili essentially also combines aspects of African Bantu languages, which up until that point in time were different dialects with Arabic. And because of the fact that the Arabs were trading, and we're talking about the 15th, 16th, 17th century, mainly the 17th century in this sense, because during the 16th century, the Portuguese started to arrive. I mean, the Portuguese, we all know that they were the main explorers at that given point in time, and they essentially led to the booming of the slave trade because they were the first Europeans to enslave West Africans, and that led to the transatlantic slave trade, and they also led to the Eastern slave trade. So they essentially ignited both sides of the world. It was very interesting.
Quite a legacy.
Yeah. So essentially, what we see in this sense is that the Portuguese arrived in Oman. The first area in the Arabian Peninsula that they arrived in was in Oman. And you have the city of Sur in Oman, which is on the coast. And this is the city, the coastal city, essentially. It was a port where thousands upon thousands of slave ships would arrive every single year with tens of thousands. At its peak, there were around 70 to 80,000 enslaved Swahili people arriving on the shores of the Arabian Peninsula every single year. And 10,000 were shipped from East Africa to the island of Zanzibar. So just for people to know, if they're not aware about the geography, because it can be quite complicated when we talk about this, we have the Swahili coast. So the main area that I'm talking about especially is Kenya and Tanzania. In Kenya, you have Lamu, you have Mombasa. In Tanzania, you have the island of Zanzibar, which is part of Tanzania today, although it is an autonomous region and they have their own identity, they have their own president. After the indigenous people of the island of Zanzibar ousted the Arabs who had been ruling Zanzibar for centuries, they essentially wanted somebody to rule them who were sub-Saharan African. So they looked to their nearest, and that was Tanzania. And that's how essentially Zanzibar and the southern island of Pemba, both of them merged with Tanzania, and how they essentially said bye-bye to the Arabs. But in a very, very gruesome chapter in human history, which essentially adds even more bloodshed to the aspect of the Arab slave trade and to decolonization because of the fact that the Arabs were very gruesome to a certain extent on the East African coast. And then the only way that this could be put to a stop, put to an end, was when the indigenous people of the island of Zanzibar essentially revolted in the 1960s and the year 1964 against the Arabs. So when that happened, you do have an explicit change in Arab and in African history because many of the indigenous people of the island of Zanzibar felt happy that they finally were in control of their own destiny. But you also had the Afro Arab population or the Arab population. Now, I would say that it is an Afro Arab population, the Omanis, because the Omanis were on the East African coast for over 3, 4, 5, 6 centuries. So because of this, they were not pure Omanis. They had mixed with the Zanzibaris, and then you had the Indians. What's interesting with the Indians is that many of the Indian communities from different parts of India, you had the Rajasthanis, the Gujaratis, the Bhojpuris, the Marathis, mainly from the western coast of India, who settled in these areas, and as well, how am I forgetting the Punjabis? You had some of them who mixed with the Arabs and with the Zanzibaris, and others who decided to retain aspects of their culture. So what is interesting is that you do have this criteria of Arabs, Africans, and South Asians mixing. We see it in Zanzibar. And then when the Omanis flee Zanzibar with the Black-led revolution in the year 1964, which essentially aimed to oust Arabs and South Asians who were seen as foreign slave traders, which was true. When that happened, a lot of the Omanis that went back to Oman were essentially Swahili Omanis, were Black Omanis, were Afro Omanis, and some were Indian Omanis, and some were Persian Omanis. So this is why I say that the ethnic aspect of Arab identity is just so fluid. And when we talk about national identity within the Middle East, it's very difficult to have a clear answer. And I mean, yeah, when the Swahili-led slave trade essentially began in the 17th and the 18th century, it was the Omanis, the Arabs that arrived. But over the years, you did have the input of different communities, of different ethnicities. And this is why people talk about the Swahili coast as essentially becoming a breeding ground for a new type of identity. And in the following centuries, the 18th, and especially most sources that I have read always talk about the 19th century. They all say that the 19th century is when we do see the term Swahili appearing in modern vocabulary, because the Arabs were referring to the people as هذول من الساحل ساحلي. So Sahel became Sahili, and in the indigenous tongues of the East Africans, it became Swahili, and then we have the word Swahili. And as a language, Swahili has 30 to 40% Arabic words, with a lot of input from Urdu, Persian, Punjabi, and even Indonesian. So that's to be honest, one of the clearest examples
Yeah, it's a great
of
example of
urbanization.
yeah, exactly. It's a great example of one of the key points of presumably your research is
Yeah.
how the slave trade affected and changed societies and countries in the nations that it touched. It's and from what you've told me there, I mean, not because like you say, it's a much more complicated thing. Not many people really understand what it is. What it is, it is not a monolithic event, as is the Atlantic one. It's an
It was
it's an
gradual.
exactly it's an older concept as well of slavery, whereas the European one was very much well, let's just get them all from Africa.
Mhm.
Slavery existed everywhere, as many scholars will tell people when they ask deeper questions about this. It's not a European problem. It existed everywhere.
It was
Everyone did it.
international.
Exactly. And for instance, in the ancient world, the Romans had no conception that you would just take slaves from one particular class, country, or race. They would, the ancient concept of it is that you subject these people, you win, you can do whatever you want with them.
Exactly.
Essentially,
And you
is
see
what.
this happening even in the Middle East, even in the medieval Islamic world and in the pre-Islamic world as well. You do have this idea of, okay, we're fighting against this tribe. They lose, we capture them, we enslave them. And that's how slavery essentially boomed. What happened essentially was that a lot of people tend to think that the Arabs solely enslaved sub-Saharan Africans. But before that happened, there was also in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, there was the Arab enslavement of Europeans. Arabs enslaved Eastern Europeans, and this is how the word Slav actually became the word slave. A lot of people don't know that the word slave or enslavement, anything that has to do with the word slave in English, comes from the word Slav, the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, because they were the main people group that were being enslaved by the Arabs and by other Europeans and by even different types of Asian populations that were living across the hordes, the entire area of Central Asia as well. So this mixture is just so complex. There's just so many layers to unpack. I mean, it's like an onion. You peel one, there's another one. And it's so interesting because of the fact that, I mean, the Levant had so many Eastern Europeans essentially that became enslaved. You had the Turks, And then the Turks as well engaged in this entire slave trade with the Arabs. And this is how coffee became the most popular drink in the world,
Yeah.
actually. So,
I was going to bring up coffee, but I was
yeah,
afraid we were going to run out of time.
I don't even know what I need to talk about anymore because there's just so much I want to say. I mean, like coffee essentially came out of Ethiopia. And when it came out of Ethiopia, to me, when people say what represents Afro Arab identity, I say coffee. Coffee represents the Afro Arab world because the plant originated from the highlands and the valleys of Ethiopia and the mountains of Ethiopia. Farmers essentially discovered that their goats were getting very active whenever they started eating those coffee beans, and they essentially traded them with the Yemenis who were living on the other side of the coast. And the Yemenis, who had interpreted Islam in a very different way, interpreted Islam with Sufism. And Sufism, which is a very different interpretation of the religion of Islam, which sees it as more of a cosmological worldview, which I really do like.
Yes.
Um, it essentially gained in popularity as a beverage in Yemen because of the fact that Sufi sages and Sufi masters essentially used to drink coffee, especially during the late hours of the evening in order to stay awake so that they would not fall asleep during the Sufi ceremonies, which would extend into 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And then it captured the attention of many of the Ottomans who were living and controlling the Arabian Peninsula. And then they sent it to Saudi Arabia, or modern day Saudi Arabia. It was called the Hijaz and Najd, these different regions. And coffee went through very different periods of being legalized and outlawed and legalized and outlawed. Like I think it was like a yo-yo effect, like
Mhm.
5 or 10 times in the contemporary Arabian Peninsula. And then it was sent to Turkey. And that is when the Turks essentially led to the boom of coffee as a beverage. And they sent it to the Venetians in Italy, and they sent it to the British and to the French. And that's how we do see the boom of the coffee trade as well, which also puts the Eastern slave trade with the Western slave trade and with sugar, and it puts it together with sugar and with tea. And it's just so complex.
It connects everything really quite well, and it makes me remember about Peter Frankopan's book, The Silk Roads,
Yes,
where he
I
said
love his book.
starts to argue that you shouldn't actually be looking necessarily at Europe for
You should be looking a bit there,
yeah,
down
a
there.
little bit over there.
So if there's any questions that you have concerning any of this, just
Oh, I mean,
shoot.
hundreds of questions, but it's like
I know. Many.
where to start, really. Maybe we should return to maybe if we should return as we sort of close up, regretfully, because I'm sure we could talk for much longer
A very
about
long time.
indeed for as many things as we really like cared to, and we will. I want Karim to come back, and the audience, I'm sure, will well do what I tell them to. He's coming back if he will come back. um, but the your book, that we want to do some professional, interviewee sort of stuff here. I'm supposed to know what I'm doing. Let's help you. Can you tell us a name?
The name. I don't know if I'm allowed to say it.
Right?
Do authors
That
usually just say the
well,
name of the book? Oh, well, I can say one thing, which I think will say a lot, even though saying nothing at the same time.
okay,
Um, is that the title of the book essentially has, in etymological terms and the actual term, in the title of the book has the mixtures between both worlds.
right, okay, excellent, fine.
I
I
think
don't
you
want
get
to
what
get.
I'm saying.
I understand. I don't want to get you in trouble.
Yeah.
The title will reveal itself. We've talked about some of the subjects, so you know what you're looking for. If someone, this is going to be a really good and important book.
Mhm.
I just realized, will it be in English? Because I may not be able to read.
Yes.
Excellent.
No,
Yes.
I mainly all write in English. I mean, I very rarely. My second language after writing in English is French. I
Mhm.
also write in. I I'm very ashamed to say I don't really write in Arabic, but I
Neither do I.
write in
Neither
English.
do I. Neither do I.
I mainly write in English, French, and Spanish, as well as Portuguese. But no, I'm mainly English. Like, that's the main
Right.
language I write in. But
Yeah.
my whole entire schooling growing up was in French, so French
Right.
is like a mother tongue, even though it's not really my mother tongue. But yeah, but it's going to be in English. And I have heard people from different backgrounds that I've talked to about when I talk about this book, and they've said that they want it in their own respective languages. So I think it's going to be translated as well in Russian, in Chinese, in Hindi, and probably in Spanish, obviously, because I know that a lot of people in the Atlantic world, in the Afro-Latin world, are interested about the Afro-Arab world. I've had a lot of people
Excellent.
from Latin America contacting me about that. They're like, "Wow, it's like
Hmm.
our part of the world, but in the East." I'm like, "Yeah,
Excellent,
in a
excellent.
way."
I'm, you know, I'm awed by that amount of linguistic excellence, being as I am a sad monolinguist who's I'm learning Spanish slowly.
We
Um,
can practice.
maybe yeah, that would be fun. And I can sort of read French with enough context, but it's I don't have an episode in Spanish yet, so
Probably soon.
yeah, as Goya said, aún aprendo. So,
No. Tienes
that
que aprender.
yeah, exactly. And the that actually, I learn. I'm always learning. It's one of the things I promised myself I would do when I was little. When I was younger, the only thing I promised I would do is I would never stop learning.
Mhm.
And I'm looking forward. I've learned so much in this conversation, you know, and I'm so looking forward to the book.
Right now, I'm contacting only publishers in the UK
Hmm.
and specifically in London,
Hmm.
hopefully. I currently have sent um, my manuscript to one publisher who has told me that he, to a certain extent, declined it because he said that he only works with academic books. And because of the fact that I want a very big audience,
Hmm.
they're restricted to only sending the book to universities. And they said that mine has, like I said, I wanted to have a huge potential. And he said that is more than they can handle. So I'm contacting another publisher in London. And I'm hopefully waiting for an answer the next week or two.
Hmm.
And if that doesn't work, I'll just look for another one. I won't take no for an answer, or I'll just self-publish it.
Well, excellent. That's great to know. That's great to know. So
Yeah.
everybody's fingers now must be crossed. Prayers, thoughts, good vibes, whatever you give out into the universe, give them
I'm
to
receiving it.
Karim.
I'm receiving it
Yeah, yeah,
all.
bring it in, bring it in.
Yeah.
Uh, inshallah,
Inshallah. Now
exactly.
you see that's Arabic. You're gonna learn Arabic as well.
I actually do want to, yes. This is a problem. But anyway, point was, best of luck with the book. It sounds great.
Thank
I
you.
really do hope that you find a really big publisher because it sounds like a book that does deserve to be uh widely distributed. And I've enjoyed it immensely, and I'm looking forward to thinking up something else we can do together, um,
Definitely.
where we can chat and share history around the internet.
Definitely. The internet
Excellent.
manages to connect people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you all for watching, ladies and gentlemen, who have reached this point. This will be probably part of the second episode. So thank you for following us all the way through. And if you liked it, do please like and subscribe. The links for Karim's social media outlets and his website and everything will also be listed below. So do please go and also follow him. And for everybody of Karim's followers who may have come to this channel to say hi, to drop a comment below. And as of the filming of this, it's still Ramadan, so I hope you have a blessed time for the rest of that period. And the same goes to you, Karim.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This was a really nice opportunity, and we had a really amazing conversation.
We did, we did.
Hopefully, this is the beginning of many more.
Hopefully, the beginning of many more.
Yeah.
If I have anything to say about it, it absolutely will be. So, thank you all for watching again, and I will see you the next time for another adventure in Historyland.